Everyone, as we bring you right now our special 30-minute report on WHAS 11 Plus, the trial of the decade in Kentucky is moving toward a conclusion now, the Crystal Rogers murder case. Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us. I'm Doug Prophet, WHAS 11 News, on what turned out to be a very busy Thursday in that courtroom. As the jury heads to the three-day holiday weekend, it was a final stunner in Bowling Green, taking a mind-boggling twist. An expert for the defense testifying that they found women's clothing, the FBI, and underwear under concrete at a home under construction where Brooks Houck was working. This happened in 2021. Our Shane McAllister joins us from Bowling Green with the details.
Well, Doug, one of the first witnesses on the stand today was Denver Butler. He's a former detective with LMPD. He's now known as a police investigations expert, and he says that he reviewed the case file for Brooks Houck and looked over a lot of the evidence that was found over many of the searches over the last decade. He talked about Crystal's car being processed and told the jury that there was no DNA from Joey Lawson or Steve Lawson found in that car. He also talked about two hairs that were found in that car that were not tested. Brian Butler, Brooks Houck's attorney, asked, should they have been tested? And Denver Butler said, yes, they should have been. They also talked about searches at Brooks Houck's home and said, was there any evidence collected there? He said, not that I'm aware of. They talked about searches at Brooks Houck's truck and said no evidence was found in the truck. They talked about searches at Nick Houck's police cruiser. Denver Butler in this case said no evidence collected that showed anything about a crime. That led us to believe that they could have found things in the police cruiser, they could have collected evidence, but that none of it made them think that they were talking about a crime. They talked about multiple police searches at the Houck farm in 2015 and said that there was no evidence of Crystal Rogers there or any of her personal belongings. They talked about a search at Anna Whiteside's car and said they found no blood evidence in her car. Of course, we do know that there was a hair found in that car and that hair was eventually revealed to be similar in characteristic to Crystal Rogers. They talked a little bit about that trunk specifically and even showed pictures of the trunk. They said they did testing on the trunk to see if there was any blood. There had been stains in the trunk. They sprayed those stains to see if there had been blood in the trunk, and it did not indicate that there was any blood in the trunk. They also talked about searching Anna Whiteside's home, said nothing of evidentiary value found there. And they tested different construction equipment, a front end loader and a shovel that was found at a property near the Houck family farm. They said in this case there was no blood found on it, there was no trace evidence found, and no evidence of Crystal Rogers on any of those pieces of equipment. This was the one that was really interesting though. Next, they start talking about what was found when a driveway was dug up in a Bardstown subdivision back in 2021. This search started with a cadaver dog walking through the neighborhood. The dog then narrows in on two properties and then narrows in further on the front of the home and the driveway. And first the driveway came up, then the front porch was dug up, and then there was a sidewalk dug up. And today we learned they did find things under that driveway. They found women's underwear with hairs under the driveway and women's clothing under the sidewalk. The defense attorney and the expert said that Crystal's DNA was not found on those items. But interestingly, later, Shane Young pressed to ask more about those items found under the driveway and under the sidewalk, saying, can you tell us about the DNA found on those items? And we learned that actually no DNA was found on those items, so it wasn't that specifically Crystal's DNA wasn't a match for DNA that was found. No DNA was found. And Shane Young, the prosecutor, pointed that out to say Crystal wasn't necessarily a match, but also not completely excluded. And the last search that they told us about here was Thompson Ridge. This is one of the more recent searches. This was December of 2023. They told us on this one they were looking for human remains, which could have included bones, teeth, blood, and they were looking for personal belongings from Crystal, like clothing, jewelry, photographs. They said that they did not find any evidence of Crystal Rogers at that search. The last search that we know about, and it appears it is the last search that they've done, was September 2024. This was in Cox's Creek on a property that has ties to the Houck family. During this search, we found out today they searched a well that was under the porch, and they searched a basement, and there was no evidence of Crystal Rogers. Doug?
Shay, part of our team there, along with Alexandra Goldberg, also in that courtroom. Alexandra and Shay have the two seat assignments for WHAS TV into this courtroom. Of course, cameras not allowed to cover this trial, so they're taking very thorough notes. And Alexandra, when Shane Young got his chance to question the defense's expert, and Alexandra, it was a bit of a tense exchange between the two.
Doug, yeah, tense is the exact word I would use to describe the exchange. And in this cross-examination, Special Prosecutor Shane Young is trying to prove that you can kill someone without leaving trace evidence behind. He brings up different causes of death: strangulation, smothering, poisoning, and says, well, that doesn't leave bodily fluid or blood behind. He even asks the witness here, Denver Butler, is it possible to kill someone without leaving bodily fluid? And the witness says yes, but the witness says the theory is that she was murdered at the Houck family farm. Quote, my experience with homicide cases is that homicides leave trace evidence like bodily fluid or blood. So Shane Young presses again, well, what about in the case here of Crystal Rogers? He says, quote, I think anything is possible, but it's highly unlikely. Then Shane Young goes on to sort of come after his credibility and his expertise as a former detective and police expert. He says, well, you've only been the lead investigator here on 6 homicide cases. And the witness says, no, it's been hundreds. Shane Young ends by saying, well, in my 27-year career, I've only seen DNA in 3 cases. That's, of course, when the defense counsel asked to approach the judge, and that conversation ended right there.
Well, Alexandra, as you heard that courtroom today, this is the only time, we're talking 2021, that police found anything during one of those many searches that we covered so thoroughly here over the years. I want to get specifically into that DNA that we mentioned just moments ago. That Crystal Rogers DNA was not found on any of that clothing, but was any DNA discovered at all on the clothing that was found underneath the sidewalk in the driveway?
Well, Doug, Shane Young's whole point here is it's not about inclusion or exclusion of characters when it comes to this DNA. It's actually that no DNA profiles were found when it comes to this women's clothing that was dug up in the Woodlawn Springs subdivision, which we know Brooks Houck was building homes under construction in that subdivision around the time that Crystal Rogers disappeared. Same thing here goes with the strand of hair found in Anna Whiteside's car. Remember, that hair had similar properties to hairs found on Crystal Rogers' hairbrush, but it came back with no DNA profile.
Finally, the jury has been really active during this trial, asking a lot of questions over the past few days. Have really ramped them up. Did they have any questions for this expert?
Yeah, Doug, I would say for this witness, they had the most questions, several. I'm going to name you some really interesting ones that jurors asked today. So one juror asked, how is blood or trace evidence affected by rain? Denver Butler says that, well, trace evidence can be diluted. He also says that DNA can be broken to be not usable. A juror asked, what about for snow? He says the same thing. Another juror asked, what about in fires? He says that that's not his expertise. He couldn't really comment on that one. And then another juror asked, well, what about what happens to trace evidence or DNA over time? And he said, well, there's a lot of factors that play into that one. He said, quote, well, when you're looking for evidence of a crime, you would expect to find DNA. Again, we hear these themes. He feels very conclusive in what they've found, or I guess lack thereof. Another juror question that really stood out to me is, so after all of these questions were asked, we had one more question from a juror. They said, well, stating that that DNA disintegrates over time, couldn't it be possible that there is no DNA? He responds, it could be possible, but there are crevices that a reasonable investigator would expect to find DNA there. He's talking about crevices in a skid steer that would have been on the Houck family farm. Doug.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. And once again, we are bringing in WHAS 11's own legal analyst, a Louisville attorney, Nick Mudd of the Mudd Law Group. Nick, a defense attorney now, but also a former prosecutor in the Violent Crimes Unit here in Louisville. Nick, big mistake here as we go into a holiday weekend to bring, this is a defense witness, Denny Butler, a respected former LMPD homicide investigator. revealing evidence we didn't know about. We left that FBI search in 2021 and had no idea what they found.
And I would say one of the most, if not the most, respected homicide detective from LMPD. I mean, he was around for years. He was around when I was a prosecutor. Was a detective there in homicide for about 20 years. I mean, homicide's a tough job. It's a very tough job as a detective. The shelf life's usually 2 to 5 years. He was there for almost 20, I believe. That being said, we did hear some disturbing things. I think on initial, when you first hear it about women's clothing, panties found in concrete that was, mixed up down and below a driveway. That being said, Doug, I think the defense here is saying, look, we're trying to show the prosecutors and law enforcement dug and dug and dug and dug, so much, in fact, that they dug up a driveway. They went and busted up a concrete, spent all this money, all these millions of dollars, and still there's not a single piece of physical evidence linking this case to Brooks Houck.
But this is the defense that brought this up. And this clothing was found under the sidewalk and under the driveway of a home that was under construction from the Brooks Houck company, Brooks Houck's construction company there, subject of a big FBI search that we covered in August of 2021. Shouldn't the prosecution have been bringing this up? They didn't.
Well, two things. Number one, my understanding is a lot of times, now this is bad craftsmanship, but people do it, and sometimes bad contractors will dump trash in a job site to kind of put some filler in for concrete. So it's a way to do a job cheaper. Again, I'm not making any comments about that, but that's my understanding. Number two, I think if it was important, the prosecution would have brought it out. Absolutely would have brought it out. But because the DNA did not match Crystal Rogers at all, I don't think it was important to their case. And certainly the defense strategy here is they're trying to look like the good guy now and say, look, we're showing you everything. Prosecutor didn't even show you this. We're showing you this because we're that confident that our client is innocent.
Does the good guy approach in the final moments of the trial as you're heading into a 3-day weekend and then closing arguments begin on Monday?
It's a little risky. Don't know if I would have done that, but I think, it's a strategy. And Denny Butler is a well-respected detective and knows what he's doing, has done hundreds of homicide investigations. And certainly I think the defense was probably prepared for that. They're not going to ask a question of an expert that they don't know the answer to. That would just be bad lawyering. And certainly he was prepped. He knew what to say. They had met with him multiple times. But that being said, it does sound odd, but I think they cleaned it up pretty well. I just think on that first sight, we all kind of have that shock value. But then when you dig a little deeper, once you kind of reasonably look at the explanation, it makes sense.
So what do you think's going through the jury's mind right now as they go into this next 3 days? Is it the fact that the DNA didn't match to Crystal Rogers, or is it the fact that women's clothing was found under concrete at a site where Brooks Houck was operating?
Well, if they look at it from a objective perspective here, they should say, hey, nothing to this was related to Crystal, and my understanding is the clothing found and that things of that nature were a much larger size than Crystal, so it wouldn't have matched her in terms of size and things of that nature. So that being said, it does still stick in the jury's mind, but they've gotten so much evidence. They have been inundated for almost 7 days now of just witness. I mean, how many witnesses, Doug? I think over 30-something maybe?
Well, the last I was counting was that we were at witness number 32. Yeah, I think we're past that now.
Right. I mean, 2.5 dozen witnesses, or maybe 3 dozen now. So, they're going into the weekend with just inundated with so much information. And especially, remember, the last 2 days have been really nothing but almost experts. We did hear Brooks Houck's sister, but it was expert after expert, a cell phone expert, a KSP, telling the truth, credibility expert with witnesses and tactics. Now we got this expert on investigative techniques. So it's a lot of information to come at a jury, and certainly it's a lot to weigh on their minds.
It was certainly something big, though, to come out of the blue, even though they're able to qualify it and say that it is not. No DNA showed up on Crystal Rogers. And then also even further than that, no DNA of her showed up in any other key search locations as well.
I think the strategy here from the defense was to say, look, there is not a single piece of physical evidence tying Brooks Houck to this crime. And by calling this expert, this homicide detective, who basically said, look, in any homicide you would expect, especially with the level of detail and care and the amount of resources been spent on this case, one would reasonably expect there to be some sort of DNA, touch DNA, blood, fingerprints, something of that nature, and none of that has existed.
Okay, coming up here toward the end of our special report here, I'm going to ask you 6 big questions going into this holiday weekend before we come back on Monday. And also 2 questions for you. I'm going to ask, why would a jury convict Brooks Houck, and why would they acquit him? Your view as we're getting ready to go in here. But right now I want to go back to Bowling Green, Kentucky, and Shay McAllister, who's also covering the case there in the courtroom. Today, the defense attempted to push back against witness testimony from those that told police they had overheard conversations about the plot to, quote, get rid of Crystal Rogers. An expert testifying today that police used deceptive tactics. Shay?
Well, this was the first witness to take the stand today. His name's Jeffrey Newshots. He's a cognitive psychologist, and he was brought on to really dive into some of the police interviews that were used in this case. He talked about some of his history, that he has been doing research on eyewitness testimony and confessions in police investigations for decades. Something many people have been asking for all of these witnesses is how much are they getting paid? They address that right off the bat. They say he's being paid $10,000. And then they start getting into the interviews. So they really focused on 2 different interviews, the interview with Kentucky State Police and Charlie Girdley, and the interview with Kentucky State Police and Heather Snellen. This is important because both of these people are key witnesses in this case. Charlie says that he overheard Joseph Lawson, talking about burying Crystal with a skid steer so no one could ever find her. And he talks about overhearing Joseph say that he would shave her head and pull her teeth and the hogs would do the rest. 2 very damning statements for the prosecution. Well, today we learned there was a lot of problematic parts of that interview. These are some of the statements that were played for the jurors today that the experts said should not be happening in police interviews. The investigators said in the interrogation room, "We can do a lot to help you. We can do a lot for you. I already know what I'm here looking for. You're not the person I'm after. We want you on our team. We can help you. These opportunities are going away, and this is the deal of a lifetime." So after listening to these different pieces of interrogations, Brian Butler asked, "Is this acceptable?" And the psychologist said, "No, it's not." He said this is very problematic, and in fact, he counted 300 different tactics that he would say are inappropriate or problematic in that one particular interview. They also talked about an interview with Heather Snellen. Again, it was with Kentucky State Police. It was the same detectives. And in this one, they say that the police are misrepresenting themselves, that they're acting like they're a friend when really they should be acting like a police officer. They're also saying things that are manipulation tactics, where they're threatening that she might not be going home to her son unless she helps them, unless she says the right thing, and that when she's crying and she's asking to leave and they're banging on the table, that is belligerent action, and that shouldn't be happening in these kind of interviews. And this expert actually testifies that these people can become worn down, and that what they say may not be true because of these tactics. Actually saying they can lead people to give statements that are in line with what they're saying and being asked instead of what is actually accurate. So very problematic. Well, Shane Young definitely had some cross for this witness. He asked for the witness to specifically explain the difference between an interview and an interrogation, pointing out that they're very different. And while many of the problematic tactics that were pointed out on the stand applied to interviews, they don't for interrogations. And he said that these were interrogations. So in an interrogation, they can interrupt a witness, they can cut them off, they can tell them the evidence that they have, they can lie about the evidence that they have. He said, and a lot of times interrogations are not pleasant. They're not easy to watch, but they are ultimately accepted by the court. And Shane Young asked one simple question here to the witness, saying, in these kinds of interrogations, can they provide true statements? And he said that is correct. So ultimately, this will be for the jury to decide if they believe that those coercive police techniques impacted the truthfulness of the statements and what they make of it. Doug?
Shay, thank you. WHS 11 News legal analyst and Nick Mudd with me, a defense attorney, and of course was on the prosecution side. So you heard all this play out today. Were these tactics over the top? Were they unusual? Were they inappropriate?
I think, certainly The detectives involved in this case sat for years. They wanted to solve it. They worked as hard as they could to get the information, to collect the evidence, to get the facts. The problem is when you get too overzealous, you do cross the line. And I will go on record in saying some of these tactics were inappropriate. Telling a woman you're going to take her children away unless she talks, it's inappropriate. It's not okay.
Some other examples, let me pass along. So you may remember Charlie Girdley. Charlie Girdley was the man who said that Joseph Lawson was going to pull out her teeth and the hogs would do the rest. So we had him come into play in an earlier testimony. This is what Brian Butler, who is the lead defense attorney for Brooks Houck, said, that Girdley had been detained for 10 hours before being interviewed for 4 hours. Butler said the defense counted, they looked at the video, that the defense counted 50 touches on his shoulder or knee. And Brian Butler said those actions show affection during the interview are wrong because the investigators aren't supposed to act as a friend in any way.
I'm not so much worried about the touches or acting as a friend. They're trying to get information. What I'm concerned about is detaining someone for 10 hours and then interviewing them for 4 hours. That's inappropriate, and I don't like it, and I don't know.
Well, Butler even went on. I mean, they were very detailed on this, spent a lot of time on these tactics. He then recounted several statements that the investigators made to Girdley. Here's some of the quotes. "We can do a lot to help you. We can do a lot for you. I already know what I'm looking for. You're not the person I'm after. We want you on our team. We can help you today. The opportunities are going away." And then, according to Brian Butler, the investigators said to Charlie Girdley, "the deal of a lifetime." What do you think of those comments?
Well, I think it shows in Girdley's testimony. He was completely, and I'm not taking sides here, Doug, I'm just going from observation. He had completely zero credibility, none. And so, you know, when you get people and you coerce them with certain tactics, and then eventually they're like, "Look, what do you want me to say? I'll say whatever." You know, especially, we're not talking about people accused either, which is still not appropriate, but we're not talking about accused, we're talking about witnesses, people that are just interviewed as witnesses here. And then later you put them on the stand years later, of course they're not credible because they weren't telling the truth then.
Go over again why Girdley had no credibility, but would investigators have known that at the time when they're interrogating him to try to get information out of him?
You would think they do, but Girdley got on the stand, and I believe, if I count it right, it was 6 different stories, and he started even twist to tell a 7th story. And so, you know, Robert Boyd did a good job in the cross-examination showing with a chart, you know, and Girdley didn't want to really give them the answers, but at the end of the day, I think it was 6 different stories he told that were completely inconsistent with one another.
That was the most bombshell comment, I think, out of this entire trial so far. Can we even believe that it was truly said about the teeth and the hogs?
Not when you have a person that can't even get their own story straight on the stand, under oath, in front of a courtroom. I don't think it has much credibility.
Okay, let's go back to Bowling Green right now. Alexandra Goldberg. Alexandra, what is left to go in this trial now that the defense has closed?
So after this holiday weekend, court will come back into the courtroom at 8:15 Monday morning. That will be counsel, media, and attendees to hear any objections. Then the jury will come in at 9, get their jury instructions, and we'll start to hear closing statements beginning with the defense, take a lunch break, then hear from the prosecution.
Before we let you go for the weekend, Alexandra, we've been getting a lot of viewer questions throughout this entire time about the environment inside the courtroom today. We got one viewer who asked this question. I actually had a person in person stop me today in Louisville and ask the same question. It was about Brooks Houck. They want to know, what's he wearing in the courtroom? I mean, is he in a suit? Is he in that orange jumpsuit? And what has his demeanor been? Can you tell us anything about his facial emotions, especially when some of these really gruesome and specific comments have been said?
Well, he looks professional. He's either in a suit or in a button-down shirt. And to give you a little bit of perspective on how that courtroom is laid out, there's 20 of us people in the media. I'm media member number 14, which means I'm sitting directly behind Brooks Houck. So I've been trying to pay attention to his demeanor to see if he's reacting to anything said about him. From what I can see, again, I just see really the back of his head. I can't see any reactions. definitely no emotion. I can hear him whisper to some of the defense counsel every now and then. Of course, Joseph Lawson is a little bit up towards my left. Same thing. Both men just listening intently, but not really reacting in the courtroom.
Okay, Alexandra, thank you very much. Alexandra Goldberg and Shay McAllister will be right back there in that courtroom on Monday as the closing arguments begin. And they'll be reporting on WHAS11.com. Check out our website and our excellent blog, also written by WHAS 11 digital journalist Joseph Garcia. Again, it returns on Monday. Thank you, Alexandra. Now I've got 6 questions for Nick Mudd, maybe a few more questions. We actually had some viewers ask questions too. First of all, I'm curious as well. Is the prosecution finished, even though we had the defense rest its case?
Yes, they are. They rest. So they did have a chance to call rebuttal witnesses. We've talked about that before. That has to only do with the proof the defense put on to say do things like impeach, which is show they're lying, or call their experts. But yes, they have now rested their case. The proof is done. There will be no more evidence presented in this case.
How does that rebuttal process work?
So normally in a rebuttal, if someone says something, a defense witness, they're allowed to call another witness to rebut that, or an expert. Let's say the expert about KSP today, and they used bad interview tactics. They could call a rebuttal expert to say no, that person is lying, or et cetera.
Let's move to Monday, the closing arguments. How do the closing arguments work? How long can they go? And how will the jury know how to apply the law that's specific to the different charges against not only Brooks Houck with the most serious charge, but also to Joseph Lawson?
So I'm gonna start at the top there, Doug. So in Kentucky, the defense goes first in closing arguments. Now, in like federal court, it's different. The prosecutor goes first, the defense goes next, and the prosecutor gets a rebuttal. But in the state of Kentucky, defense goes first. Now, the question is, who goes first in terms of Brian Butler and Steve Shoring, or Robert Boyd and Kevin Coleman? I believe Kevin Coleman and Robert Boyd are going first, so Joey Lawson will be closing first, I believe, is my understanding. Then it'll be Brooks Houck's attorneys, then the prosecution will get the final word. Now, my understanding is they have set aside about 6 hours for closing arguments. That's a long time. So each side's going to get a couple hours. I mean, I've had one judge give me 15 minutes, and she just said that's how it is. That was our rule. So I've seen closing arguments go for 2.5 hours. You don't want to bore the jury in closing. That goes for whether you're a defense lawyer or a prosecutor. But you asked me another question, Doug, which is a great question about the law that's applied. So when they come back on Monday morning, the lawyers will litigate outside the presence of the jury what's called the jury instructions. And the jury instructions are essentially the instruction that that the judge gives to the jurors that says, look, you may have in your mind what murder is. You may have in your mind what tampering with physical evidence is. But that doesn't matter. What matters is the elements and the law that I'm giving you. That's the law that you have to apply.
Don't they in that negotiation you just talked about, don't they even go right down to the specific wording to make sure it's clear so that there's no confusion? Because I've been in a lot of trials covering them before when you go, what was that jury instruction? It seemed like the jurors were left with so much confusion to make that decision.
Yeah, and I have fought over a comma or a semicolon and screamed over an and or an or, and that can be big fights. I mean, it really can with lawyers. And I am surprised that they're doing it right before on Monday, but that's my understanding. And Doug, here's the thing, that process can take hours. I've been in a situation in a murder trial about 12 years ago to where it was very contentious. I was the prosecutor at the time, the defense lawyer and I remember the judge at the time was, he even took us back into chambers because it was very specific language, and that it can matter. I mean, we're talking about someone's freedom here.
When they finish the closings on Monday, will it go immediately to the jury? Will the deliberations begin? So
normally it does go to the jury, but the way the judge has scheduled it, because I think he thinks the closing arguments are going to go so long and the jury's going to be exhausted after hearing up to 6 hours of closing, he's going to send them home and then bring them back Tuesday morning, give them the law, et cetera, and say, hey, here's the jury instructions, go and go sit and talk for Lord knows how long.
So far, do you see anything in this case, any rulings by the judge that could lead to a possible appeal or any kind of issue if either get convicted?
You know, I saw some issues in the last trial with Steve Lawson. Again, I'm not the judge. Judge Sims is very experienced. He knows what he's doing. I've been in front of him. He's a great judge. But that being said, I did see some possible issues in the Steve Lawson trial for appeal. But this case, really, I think the judge had a trial run there and kind of cleaned up any issues. And there really hadn't been any, I mean, if these individuals get convicted, there really aren't any big appeal issues at all. There's been no huge fights. Everything was pretty much settled what we call pre-trial, before the trial. So, you know, I don't see there being any appeal issues right now that I would hang my hat on if I were a defense lawyer.
I'm going to wrap up to my final questions in just a second, but excuse me, I want to give a viewer question. We had several asked questions. This is from Charlotte Grimes. Are all of these people being paid to testify both sides? Are all of them being paid to testify both sides?
Well, now the police officers and detectives, things like that, they're doing that in the course of their employment. So they're getting their regular, you know, pay, et cetera. Any experts, whether they're experts for the prosecution or the defense, are getting paid, and they generally get paid pretty well. I mean, I think we've heard multiple people here, Doug. I mean, we need to come up with a different line of work because they're getting paid $10,000 each, I think, for a day or so of testimony, right?
Sometimes just a few hours.
Yeah, just a few hours. I mean, certainly they may have looked at stuff, but they are definitely getting paid well. But that goes for both prosecution and the defense. Any experts are going to get paid pretty well, and that's not uncommon in these kind of cases.
I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you a couple of different versions of this similar question. What happens if there is a not guilty verdict?
Certainly, if that happens, you know, it sends a shockwave through, I think, the city of Bardstown.
All of Kentucky.
All of Kentucky, absolutely.
We call it the trial of the decade because it really is the biggest trial we've had in the last 10 years on a case we've followed for 10 years.
Right, but in terms of just legally, they will both be released from custody immediately. I mean, unless there's any other charge that we don't know about that's coming, I don't believe there is, they literally would be probably sent back to the holdover to get their stuff and be released from custody, and they could be released from the county they're trying the case in.
If there's a guilty verdict next week, what potentially, how much time is Brooks Houck facing versus Joseph Lawson?
So Joseph Lawson, the main charge of the conspiracy, which is 10 to 20 years, I think the tampering's on there is 1 to 5. So he's really facing it depended on how he got convicted. He could really face a minimum of 1 year if he only got convicted of tampering. If he got convicted of conspiracy, he gets a 10-year minimum. His maximum, though, would be 25 years. Brooks Houck, on the other hand, his minimum, if he gets convicted of murder, his minimum is 20 years, okay? His maximum, Doug, is life in prison. So, I mean, this is real deal. It's serious.
Is this a life in prison case?
It could be. You know, if a jury looks at this case and they are disgusted and they think that he needs to be locked up for the rest of his life, they very well could give him life in prison.
Again, this is a circumstantial case. We don't have a weapon,
right.
We don't have a scene, and as we well know by now, we do not have the body of Crystal Rogers or her remains. My two final questions for you. Why would a jury convict Brooks Houck?
Why would a jury convict Brooks Houck? I think that's a great question, and I think that it comes down to the argument of Crystal Rogers was last seen, we know by phone records, with Brooks Houck. We know she stopped playing games between around 9, I think it was 9:28 p.m. We knew they had a night together. That's the last person that she was seen alive with, and that we know that she was with alive, okay? Now, add all the other circumstantial evidence we've heard. No smoking gun, no real physical evidence, but everything surrounding that. I think a jury could potentially look at all that and say, we know you did this, and the prosecution has proved it because we're using our common sense, and we're going to convict you.
Based on what you've seen, the flip side to that, why would a jury acquit Brooks Houck?
Brooks Houck could get acquitted if the jury says, you know, we think you did it, but the prosecutor didn't prove it. And Doug, I've had that happen in cases before. I had it on a homicide. Jury came out, they hung 9-3. I interviewed the jurors after, and I went back and I did what they told me to do, and we later got a conviction on the guy. But
do you believe there's enough reasonable doubt in this case right now?
That's the question. You know, that's certainly up to the jury, but the defense is going to hit on this fact. There's no physical evidence. You know, she had a flat tire on the side of the road, and we don't know what happened to her. And our client had nothing, you know, they're going to say, our client had nothing to do with it, and they haven't proven any motive. Now, the prosecution doesn't have to prove motive, but, you know, when we heard about the motive that from Rosemary Houck and Nick Houck, and they didn't like her and they wanted to get rid of her. But certainly we haven't heard any strong proof, like a text message or something like that, that really ties it in hard for a motive. Like, oh, this is over child custody. Oh, this is over, you know, not this kind of case, but over stolen goods or drugs or something like that. But certainly the defense is going to hit on that hard. And they're going to hit on the fact that there's no physical evidence. They're going to hit on the fact that we don't know what Crystal did. And more importantly, which is what they did today, they're going to say, look, it wasn't for lack of trying. The prosecutor's office, the FBI, the local sheriff's department, the police, KSP have tried for years to dig and dig and dig and dig and dig, and they just didn't find anything.
That's right, and you added an extra one to the list we just gave, that we don't know a motive. We still don't know a motive. A lot of speculation.
We don't.
So with so many witnesses that had credibility issues, do you believe that the only evidence anybody can hang their hat on and believe are those phone records because the cell phone data is irrefutable?
You got to be careful with credibility, because I tell you, Doug, just because someone has told 5 stories doesn't mean the jury doesn't believe them. Just because someone's lied in the past doesn't mean a jury doesn't believe them. Just because somebody's a drug addict, a convicted felon, or had a rough life doesn't mean a jury doesn't believe them. So we have to be careful with that. There are times when I've had witnesses, I thought, well, nobody's going to believe this guy. And the jury's like, it was the one guy we believed. We looked straight in his eye and we thought he was telling the truth. So, you know, you never know.
What the defense's move today was certainly interesting to bring up the clothing.
It was.
Again, no DNA match of Crystal Rogers, and we leave it at that. As we go into this long weekend, thank you very much, Nick. Nick will be back here with me, along with Shay and Alexandra, coming up on Monday as the closing arguments begin. Then it'll get to the jury, and we do not know how long it'll take them to deliberate this case. Of course, they've got 2 major charges to face, talk over this time: the murder charge for Brooks Houck, tampering with physical evidence, and conspiracy to commit murder for Joseph Lawson. That's our 30-minute special report for you here. As we wrap it up, we'll have coverage again on Monday on our Channel 11 WHAS TV newscasts at noon, 4, 5, 6, and 11 on the night team on Monday. And again, we'll be back right here at 9 p.m. on Monday night as we take a deep dive on the trial of the decade underway in Kentucky, now coming to a close next week, the Crystal Rogers murder case. I'm Doug Proffitt. Thank you very much for watching.